and then again in the I states there, Indiana, Illinois, and then down into Missouri, coming in at the 40th on the dry side. Again, kind of a mixed bag of issues, as we'll talk about as we go along here. Since we're in the middle of the month, we'll look back at the last 30 days also. Precipitation in the upper left-hand side and percent of normal, percent of average precipitation in the lower right-hand side. The Dakotas kind of stick out here in that there's not been, over the last 30 days, much precipitation in the Dakotas. Totals up there of less than an inch to less than half an inch over large chunks of the area. You might think this could be a problem, but the Dakotas and northern Minnesota tend to be a little wetter starting off and have problems with getting soils to warm up, or there's a perception of that. So the idea of drier conditions really is not showing as much of a problem there. That wet area from Kansas over to Michigan has really borne out some problems in the way of getting planting season started, slowing field progress. Reports from Kansas, Iowa being a little slower, and reports from Michigan that really not much is happening up there because of very wet conditions, which we'll talk more about as we go along also. To contrast that, and to show another reason why, when we show that the dry conditions up in the Dakotas and northern Minnesota, they're not being much of an issue, we're going to look back a little bit and look at the last 6-month period, percent of normal precipitation over the last 6 months. So our color scale here is anything in the brown to orange is below average. Even the yellows are below average. Greens to purples are above average. So you see some places that over the last 6 months show up very interestingly. Despite that dry period in the Dakotas, most of North Dakota and part of South Dakota are still above average, even somewhat above average precipitation for the last 6 months, despite the dryness recently. A little bit of dryness in southeastern South Dakota up into Montana. Then an area from southern Minnesota, Iowa, over into Wisconsin that's running 150 to 200% of average. And note that especially in part of that region we just talked about there doesn't include some very heavy rainfalls that happened back in September. So we still have some very deep soil moisture issues going on there. And then you look further south, down here into Missouri, southern Illinois, an interesting contrast we've had throughout the winter is that generally people are not considering this area too dry at this point, despite there being 50 to 70% of average precipitation over the last 6-month period. It's been an interesting contrast and an ongoing conversation we've had of how dry is it really and what are the issues related to that. Now we're going to move back up to the 30-day period, looking at the last 30 days departure from normal temperature. Generally, overall, warmer than average conditions everywhere across our region, ranging from at the lowest maybe 2 to 4 degrees above average to 8 degrees above average. So very warm conditions, even despite a couple cool periods that we have going on. And back in March, this has produced a different set of issues, which we will talk about as we get along to some of our impacts region here. 7-day average stream flow, same color scale again. Everything that's in the green here is in the middle of the distribution, so around what would be expected this time of year. Ones that are in the light blue to royal blue are above average in that area. We've talked about being wet before, from Kansas to Iowa up into Michigan. All running above normal to much above normal throughout much of that area. Just south of there, if you look into, say, Ohio, down in southern Indiana, southern Illinois, and Missouri, some of the shorter-term and longer-term dryness is showing up there, where you have what's falling in the below normal category in the way of stream flow. So some pockets of below normal there, which will show up when we get to look at the U.S. Drought Monitor. The wet areas show up fairly well. And then as we look further west, blue to black is the highest stream flow, would be considered highest stream flow on record, where we have a decent snowpack, a very good snowpack in some areas, which we will touch on as we get to those here. So if you combine all these issues and put them into what's going on with the most recent U.S. drought monitor just released this morning, generally wetter areas overall prevail, so that lots of white in our map here. If we look at the over the whole region, only about 19% of the area in our region we cover here is D0 or higher. And in the actual drought categories, D1 to D4, there's just over 2%. Pockets of northwest or northeast Wyoming, parts of Colorado and Montana that have missed out on some of the bigger precipitation events. And as we're going ahead here, we may do some numbers on those, and even pockets of D0 down here that we'll probably be eliminating as we go along. But overall, very low drought coverage and not a whole lot of issues in the areas that are drought covered, just small pockets and no real major issues at this point. So let's talk about some of our issues as we're going, other issues going along. Looking at agriculture, what's going on in the way of ag? Current soil temperatures, we start looking at when we're getting in the midst of planting season, when it is appropriate to be planting. Soil temperatures above 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're talking at 4 inches. Bare soil cover is appropriate for planting small grains, your wheats, your rye, oats, those kinds of things. And we're looking at a 50-degree soil temperature that is appropriate for corn planting. So this is from the USDA Office of the Chief Economist. We have above 50 temperatures throughout much of the main part of the Corn Belt, indicating that soil temperatures, despite some wet conditions, are appropriate for people to be planting. It's become more of an issue of can you get in the field to be able to do that. So we look further north, not quite 50 degrees, so corn planting is going to be limited just yet, and then even some 30s as we look further up. But we're still a little bit early for the planting season in those areas as we're looking ahead. There is a spot, and you may notice in north central Iowa here. No, there's not a problem, or there's not an anomaly there. There is a bad data point that is being incorporated into the analysis. So it would be probably mid-50s to low 50s in that region also. Looking at topsoil moisture, again, this is data from USDA NASS. What's going on in the way of topsoil, and this is percent of topsoil being reported as surplus as of the end of the week here. And the bluer the area is, the higher percentages of topsoil considered surplus. You can see that again, wet area, 25 to 39% in Wisconsin, 56 in Michigan. Quite a bit of the area that is considered surplus topsoil moisture, even some in the eastern areas of the Corn Belt. Illinois and Missouri, not quite as much. Then you get out in the plains, lower areas of topsoil moisture being considered percent surplus. If you look at topsoil moisture that's short to very short, much of that northern and eastern area, really not much showing up as short. If you get over into the plains in Missouri, there still are pockets that are showing up as short to very short. And despite some of the wet areas we're going to talk about in Wyoming and Colorado, they are reporting topsoil moistures that are short to very short. And that is more in the plains areas where some of the recent warmth has started to dry out some of those conditions in that area. So where are we on the planting progress? As of April 16th, we're always curious, what's going on in the way of planting. We're a little bit early in that corn planting progress. You see fairly small percentages planted throughout most of the corn growing areas. Texas, not a huge corn supplier, but is 60% planted. Most of our area is just a few percent. Illinois, probably the biggest one, that's 7%, and Kansas and Missouri is 8 and 9% behind. Again, those drier conditions limiting people being able to get out in the field to get things done. We're at a point, and overall, from a national standpoint, 6% planted, 3% behind the 5-year average. That's not a major issue at this point, and seemed to be the comment from most people, at least in this area, that people want to get started planting. They're not concerned yet, but if we go another week without a lot of progress, then there will be start to be some nervousness about getting things planted. For those of you not in the ag area, the later you get planted, you know, there's less time for crop development, less yield potential. You lose some yield potential on corn and soybeans. Note that I'm not going to show you a soybean map because typically soybeans are planted after corn, though I did get 2 reports, one from southeast Iowa and one from southern Indiana, of people who have planted soybeans already, and I did get a report from central Iowa of corn that has emerged already. Oats, not a big cash crop in a lot of areas, but noting again being somewhat behind in the oats area except for South Dakota and Nebraska, where they are mostly planted, and ahead of the 5-year average in those situations. Spring wheat, similar sort of thing, a little bit behind except for South Dakota. Sorghum, not a big crop in our area except for Missouri, and sugar beets, only North Dakota, Minnesota, and Michigan are the ones there. They are also behind in their planting because of the wet conditions. Okay, let's skip up to water and snow here. A wide variety of water conditions and ice that we're also concerned about, and snow for runoff. A photo here from one of the issues, Michigan State having some flooding on campus because of the excess precipitation. Look at the Great Lakes. We'll start on the east side here of what's going on. Most of these maps are of lake temperatures. One of the comments that came out of the Great Lakes folks is that, you know, water temperatures being a fair amount warmer than average for this time of year, not as much ice that was accumulated on the lakes. In fact, there's only about 0.2% of the Great Lakes that are covered by ice, and that is in Huron at this point. Most of the other lakes are ice-free. You see water temperatures here in southern Lake Michigan and Erie are above 40 degrees already, and relatively warm even as we go further north. So that, you know, will have an impact on helping them warm up in that area because of the overall warmer temperatures. Moving ahead as we look further west, now we're going to talk about snow because of the impact on stream flows out in that part of the region. To point out a few pictures here, the image we're looking at is from NRCS Portland, where we're looking at the snow water equivalent, or abbreviated SWE, how much water is compared to average for this time of year. Anything that's in green is 90 to 109% of average, so right about the middle of the distribution. Anything that's down in the orange or red is down to below average. Red's less than 50%, and then I'll get up into the darker blue is 150% of average. Point this out because it does have an impact on what we're going to see in the way of stream flows and what we're looking at in the way of water out in the region. You know, much of Montana is around that average, except up northern Montana is a little bit ahead of average, a little bit behind out in these basins. Sorry, I don't identify these basins, but these are generally leading into the Missouri River from the Montana area. As we look down into Wyoming, they called it I guess a dichotomy. The western Wyoming, extremely high. I think the comment for the Wind River Basin was the highest on record. You're looking at, in some places, almost double the average amount of water available, snow water available, which is going to be producing some problems and has already produced some flooding problems as this starts to melt out. Interestingly enough, when you look on the eastern side of the state, no snow water equivalent in some of the higher elevations there, and lesser ones in other areas. So we're going to show you some maps for projected amount of water coming from these areas. Colorado has been pretty good overall, but it's been dropping relatively quickly. I'm going to show you an interesting graphic on that because of the early season warmth. One of the issues with the early season warmth here was an early melt-off, and then that's probably part of the issue here too in eastern Wyoming. The early season warmth and lower elevations has helped melt out some of the snowfall. Okay, a couple graphics here from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers looking at projections of their amount of runoff that's going to be flowing into the Missouri River. Interestingly enough, on the left-hand side, this is above Fort Peck, so this is mainly Montana, runoff from the streams in Montana. There's expectation is about 96% of average. We're right at the peak time here. We start to fall off typically after this, so close to average, and that kind of fits in with what the snowpack we're projecting there. The stream flow, on the other hand, what we're expecting to get from mountain snowpack in the Fort Peck to Garrison, this more comes out of Wyoming, is 132% of average. We've seen a sharp increase in that over the last few months, where we're going to get a lot more runoff because of that high snowpack that will be leading into the Missouri River in that area. If we look at the North Platte, and this, you see two things here, from total from the North Platte and the South Platte, 92 and 94% of average is where we are right now, so a little bit below average. You see those have both fallen off because of that warm period in March. You can see this peaked and dropped off in both of these, but then there have been a couple events since then that have produced additional snowfall that's you kind of had this dip and then return to peak there. So expecting pretty good stream flow there, though drier conditions and early melt off may decrease the amount of stream flow they're expecting to get in those areas. So far, the main reports that people are concerned about in the way of stream flows are in the Wind River Basin, parts of Wyoming, where there's expected to be problems. Other places there may be some minor flooding, potentially on the Platte, either of the Plattes, when you combine this snowpack with typical spring convection, are the main areas we're concerned about there. Okay, some other issues we have going on right now that have been caused by this late season or late warm winter and early spring. We talked about last month early season fire issues, some very severe early season fire issues because of the early warmth. With recent rainfalls and green up, we've largely reduced those, so we don't have much of a problem with those now. Thankfully, we've done that situation, taken care of that situation. Pollen reports, because of the early spring growth and a lot of plants and allergies have been setting in early. We don't have official data on this, but people with allergies are reporting early kick-ups in allergies. And also mosquito reports from last month in Indiana. We did get reports there, and from our state climatologist in Michigan, noting that some of those from Indiana had been brought northward, so that they were getting mosquito reports in Indiana. Another one, overseason overwintering of this is called henbit from Tyler Williams. It's a winter annual. Because of the warm winter, we're seeing some interesting season growth. A few other issues from our warm winter. Several comments from state extension services and other reports of reduced winter die-off of various insects will allow them to be reintroduced more readily. Black cutworm and armyworm are two that are noted, particularly starting off now, and I've mentioned the mosquitoes already. A report from Illinois was talking about, because of the very warm winter, cover crops. Cover crops are used to that will grow and protect the soil by covering the soil during the winter time. The warm winter temperatures allowed for extensive cover crop growth. Just locally here in our lab, we did get a comment talking to a couple of our cover crop experts. Typically the way a cover crop is planted in the fall, grows a little bit, keeps the cover, starts to regrow in the springtime, and then needs to be terminated, killed with like a glyphosate that will kill this off. Typically, what happens is, because temperatures are cooler and these cover crops are not as actively growing, when you spray them with the glyphosate, they don't respond as quickly. And these researchers did note that this year there has been much quicker coverage, on the order of just a few days, killing off these cover crops and making it appropriate to start planting. Another issue, nitrogen loss. There are still producers. This is not commonly recommended, not recommended in eastern areas, really not used much of anymore, where you put nitrogen on the fall and that is, if the soil temperatures are, especially freezing soil temperatures, the nitrogen will stay there throughout the winter. But with the warm winter temperatures, there's been what's called mineralization and converting that nitrogen to a form that does not stay in the soil and can be lost when you have heavy rainfalls. That has been pointed out as a potential issue from some people in Iowa who still use this practice. We did talk a little bit about last month, and we have a little bit more information now on our early spring freeze. One of the other issues we noted was because of the warm winter, especially late winter and early spring, pushed early development in perennials. We're talking fruit trees, shrubs, bushes, flowers, alfalfa on the agricultural side, much earlier than we would expect, 2 to 3 weeks across many areas in the eastern part of our region. Also winter wheats out in our plains areas and some of our eastern areas where there's winter wheat grown. We did have temperatures after that warm period that reached down into the teens, even low teens in mid-March, which is not that climatologically odd, but when we had these early development going on, there were a lot of crops susceptible. So some of the issues, we ended up with some positives actually and some negatives because of that. Fruit trees typically produce more blooms than they can actually support fruit. So the freeze actually removes some of those blooms, and we did get reports of some orchard folks saying that they saved some labor costs because they removed the blooms that they would have had to have done chemically or mechanically otherwise. We did hear though on the downside, alfalfa being damaged. Some reports were that even good alfalfa stands in the eastern part of our region were damaged because of this freeze. They'd started to grow already. Reports from Iowa were that it was only the poor alfalfa stands that had been damaged with the temperatures that were in the teens, which is, we were surprised the amount of the lack of damage we saw because of this. Michigan's reporting having to do early spring spraying on fruit crops because of disease pressures. And then there was another freeze just about 10 days ago in Kansas that seemingly has the coldest temperatures were not in the areas where wheat was most susceptible. So just kind of showing you from the National Phenology Network, another one of our partners, where we are on the spring leaf index anomaly. Most of the region is in some form of spring growth at this point, kind of giving you an idea of where things are susceptible. The largest area is mainly down from Ohio, down into obviously Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, parts of Ohio. Southern Michigan is also at some risk at this point. These other areas where you do have some dormancy break are used to being cold. And we put that in the context of, even though we are the third week of April, we're still not past the time where we can have freezing conditions. This map from the Midwest Regional Climate Center, a VIP program, indicating that the yellow is showing the time right now is only about the median or middle of the distribution where we can have the last time going below 32. So saying that half the time we still get temperatures below freezing down in this area, and up in the green areas we've still not reached that middle point. So still very much at risk up in these areas. It doesn't sound like most problem crops are at much of a risk right now. Maybe wheat could still be an issue in South Dakota. But down in here, we do have still some level of risk going on. We don't see freezing conditions coming up just yet, but we do have some colder temperatures coming in the couple-week period. We're going to watch closely to see what happens in the way of cold temperatures. Okay, jumping into the outlooks now. Obviously where we are at this point, what we could be looking at going ahead. We're going to start off again talking about El Nino. 7-day, 8 to 14-day, looking at May, and then our summer and growing season. Just updated what our probabilities are on El Nino. A lot of discussion with El Nino, and the reason for this is because if you remember where we've been over the last couple of years, 2 years ago we had a very strong El Nino. And then this last winter we had a relatively weak but did have a La Nina. And then typically, after that we would see La Nina conditions or neutral conditions stick around for a year or two. So what we are seeing is really very odd. In fact, I looked at over the last 60 years where we have good sea surface temperature data assessing what's going on with El Nino. Only once have we gone through what we could see here, and that's going from strong El Nino to a La Nina and back to an El Nino in back-to-back years. We've only seen that one time. So therefore, the models are handling this very differently. If you look at the dynamical models that run the physical models, they're the ones that are being more bullish with us going back to El Nino conditions. The statistical models, which are based on statistics, are a little less bullish with trying to get us back to El Nino. So if you sum that all together, what we're looking at is that these are the probabilities of being in La Nina, neutral, or El Nino conditions for each one of the 3-month periods. So as we look out into the summer, by late summer, July, August, September, the chances of being in El Nino actually slightly outweigh the chances of being in neutral. And then as we go on into next winter, that is the most likely outcome. So I'm calling it somewhat likely that we're going to be in a form of El Nino sometime by this winter. I've heard people talking about El Nino conditions starting already in the summer. Not hanging my hat on that very much at this point. More likely the impacts of El Nino showing up at best by late summer, maybe into the fall. And because of that uncertainty, that's why NOAA has not gone to the El Nino watch. El Nino watch is the first category going into a full-fledged El Nino advisory. Okay, looking at the next 7 days, what's going on in the way of projected precipitation? These are we're expecting to stay relatively active in our region, but for good or for bad, for a lot of the folks here, the wetter area has moved further south from, say, Oklahoma, southern Missouri into the Ohio Valley, where several inches of rain could be happening over the next week. You see up in a good chunk of our agricultural area, we have a relatively quiet period going from currently into the middle of next week. It looks like the middle of next week before the next chance of precipitation comes. So that may open up an opportunity, hopefully, if soils get dry enough, and hopefully people are not getting into wet soils too much, where we can get some planting activity. If soils are appropriate, we do have large equipment. Planting can occur very quickly these days. Looking at the 8 to 14 day time period, now you see a little bit of a change coming. We're looking at the end of April into the first week of May. The temperature, especially in the northern plains, looks like we have kind of what we call a trough, but a larger area of colder temperatures is likely to cover that area. Now, this does not necessarily guarantee that we're going to see freezing conditions if you're concerned about that, because we can be below average and still be above freezing at this point, but it would increase the chance of being below freezing in that area. Eastern areas that are more susceptible are still staying on the warmer side of average, as the jet's probably going to be kind of parked over the middle part of the region. But what that also means is with the jet parked over the middle part of our region, we're going to continue to have above average chances for precipitation as we're entering that time period. So that doesn't portend well for people being delayed in the way of planting. Month of May, overall, now you see a bit of a change in this. There is some concern about this overall cold and how it will impact, how long it will stay and impact the month of May, so that the only area that's projected to be above average as above average is the most likely outcome is the eastern part of the Corn Belt. Much of the Midwest, Northern Plains has EC of equal chances for below or above average as we head into May. Precipitation-wise, now this is where we get another shift. The wet area, most likely wet area, is in the Northern Plains, which kind of stays with us in the summertime. But we see the first appearance of this drier than average area. Not a great deal of confidence in this, but the computer models have been hinting at this, that the eastern part of the Corn Belt, somewhere in the eastern part of the Corn Belt, has some dryness that could occur as we get into late spring and summer, while the wetness stays out in the plains, and we'll show you that in the next jump here. What this would portend for us is that there's less risk of this long, cold, wet spring going on. We still have a good chance of getting things planted without any kind of major issue. Our wetter conditions could stick with us out in the plains area. You see a similar pattern as we jump ahead through June to August. I've not shown May, June, July. May, June, July looks very similar to this. So we have more area that is projected to be warmer than average as we go on through the June through August period. From a precipitation standpoint, the wetter area is more likely out into the western plains, into the mountain areas, and this drier area is mostly over the Great Lakes. Again, sticking with that, some hints of dryness that occurred in the eastern Corn Belt in the models and wetter out in the plains. That's kind of been the semi-consistent message among the models. How much should we believe the computer models at this point, especially in precipitation? They don't handle that as well, but you do look for things like consistency. Because of the overall wet conditions and expected precipitation and and uncertainty about dryness, our seasonal drought outlook throughout our whole region has improving conditions, the little bit of areas that are in drought right now, and unlikely to, and not pointing out any dry areas that are listed. Does this mean we're not going to have any drought areas occur over the region? No. I would not say that, but we don't have enough evidence to point to areas specifically at this point. So, to kind of summarize where we are at this point, very warm start early in the year. If you look at it nationally, I didn't mention this, we are second nationally for the January through March period. Introduced various impacts, which we talked about. Varying wetness, differing issues. Some areas in the southern part of the Corn Belt have been able to make progress so far. Further north, less progress has been made because of wet conditions. And even places that have been dry this spring, we have some carryover fall issues from precipitation. The early season warmth, we avoided many major freeze issues. We had real concerns. There are going to be some major freeze damage. Overall, the amount of damage, everyone was remarked how we just dodged a bullet, and did introduce a set of other various issues, insect and human health we mentioned. From an outlook standpoint, we are not in an El Nino advisory yet. We'll have to keep and see an eye what NOAA does next month. So we'll make any more commentary on that, but we seem to be trending towards it back to El Nino conditions, especially more likely into the fall. Our near-term planting issues are going to be with us. We do have a window opening up in the Iowa, maybe from the South Dakota, Iowa, part of Illinois area, with a quiet period here before we start getting more back into precipitation chances by week 2. Hopefully we do get some activity done, because it looks like we still have probabilities of slowing things down. That wetter area that is projected over the next week, I mentioned over the Ohio Valley area. Currently the Ohio River is running about 2/3 of average, so it can handle more stream flow at this point with that issue. As we move on into summer, warmer likely for nearly the whole region this summer, except for the far northern plains area. We do have some pockets of dry possible in the east. Not a great deal of confidence, but there is some hints that way, and a better chance of being wetter out in the plains area as we're looking ahead. So, just a reminder of our partners, a number of our websites where we find some of this information and connections to our partners, and then we bring around to our key contributors and folks who help produce and make this available for you. So, I'd like to open it up for questions now and see what is on your mind.
So, Dennis, could you go back to, thank you for that, and could you go back to the median last spring 32-degree freeze slide, please?
Sure can.
The question there is to clarify a little bit about what that map is actually saying, and let's see. Yeah, just clarify what that map is showing.
Sure. Let's take the yellow area through the middle part of the region. That is saying that the median, or we'll call it average in this case, last occurrence of 32 degrees is between April 21st and April 30th. Okay, that's kind of what we're showing you here. That date gets earlier. We've passed that median date a little bit further south. Down in the southern areas here, we're brown. We're looking at dates in the first 10 days of April. If you look, say, up in Montana here, parts of Montana, that median date is the end of May. Now, that is the middle of the distribution. If you think about that bell curve, this is the middle part of it. What that also means is that after this date, half the time after that date, you still, half the years you still have a freeze after that date. And we're talking about 32 here. So we still are at some risk climatologically. We can't say specifically about this year just yet. Some risk down here, much more risk up here because climatologically it's just that last date, we've not reached that last date yet. So that's what we're trying to cover there.
Okay. Thanks on that. And then another quick question: what years or year did ENSO go from El Nino to La Nina to El Nino? Do you remember when that was, Dennis?
It was in the late 60s, I believe.
Okay.
It was late 60s or late 50s. Yeah.
And as Dennis was saying, that's sort of a precedent-setting situation if it were to happen again. It's a relatively rare thing. The other possibility of what could happen this year, just to keep it in the realm of possibilities, is that we could sort of venture into above normal, slightly above normal temperatures that don't actually qualify. There's a way of we measure whether an El Nino is actually fully realized or not, and it may not quite reach all those criteria, but still act a little bit like what we would see with a regular El Nino to some degree. So that's a possibility. I think that, and this is somewhat speculative on my part, but and I think Dennis wouldn't disagree, the chances of going into a full-blown strong or even moderate El Nino are relatively small, even if we would track into an El Nino. But again, that's sort of speculative at this point.
Yeah, and what kicked off the discussion was there was a pool of, and I should have shown this slide. There was a pool of warm water in the eastern Pacific that was quite warm, especially for this time of year. But that has weakened somewhat, and if you look at subsurface temperatures, there's not as much subsurface support for those warmer than average temperatures. So we'll probably go a little quiet on the El Nino side here and wait for it a little bit. And then Barb just typed in here, thank you Barb for adding that. It was 64, 65 La Nina and then 65, 66 El Nino. So thank you.
Do we have an estimate on how much of the mountain snowpack has melted out at this point, and when do we expect the peak runoff into the Missouri River from the amount that remains? It's a tough question. I think even if you'd ask the forecasters, they would have some trouble. But looking at climatology, how much is melted out, I can't tell you other than the lower elevations. Certainly with Colorado, well, the whole Rockies being warmer than normal in March and not seeing extreme precipitation or any major precipitation during that time, they lost a lot of their snowpack, mainly I'd say south of Wyoming, but some places even in Wyoming and north have seen some degradation of their snow. Dennis, what would you say about that?
Well, yeah, I just pulled up, what we're seeing from the Corps of Engineers. If you're looking at what you are in the way of the mountain snowpack, yes, lower elevations, we've seen some, a decent amount of melt off, and probably upper elevations have started, but you still have a large amount of snow available out there. We've only started to see an overall small fall off. So we're going to start that peak melt off here pretty readily. We saw in the stream flows already. Part of this depends on this cold that's coming in week 2, if we do get a protracted period of colder temperatures, we will start, continue that melt off. It just may be slowed down. If that doesn't materialize, then we're going to push that along more quickly.
Generally, the April 15th is about the end of the, on average, the end of the accumulation season for snowpack across much of the Rockies. Now, again, with the colder air coming and better chances for precipitation, we'll expect that some of that snowpack to either rebuild or increase over the next, I guess, week or two, and then have that snow melt. Now, obviously, there has been accumulations into May, positive accumulations into May, where the snowpack will continue to increase. So it's not unheard of that could also happen. Okay.
Other questions?
Yeah. Has to do with flood risk to Fremont County, Iowa. Okay, for this spring, June to August, as the Rocky snowpack comes off the snowpack. Yeah, so my understanding of the risk to sort of the Missouri, specifically the Missouri River basin, is that the chances of the Missouri River itself flooding because of snowmelt alone is relatively low, especially as you get further down the basin. Now, that said, if some major precipitation event that we don't foresee happens, we certainly could see flooding in the lower basin, and I think that's sort of where you're asking. Lower basin, Fremont County, I'm assuming, is in the lower basin of the Iowa. If it's in Iowa, it's in the lower basin. So there are other things that could complicate that, and if the Platte River is high, or there are these record extreme events, not that we're foreseeing any, could obviously lead to precipitation. Or flooding, I mean.
Yeah. The Corps' commentary is that, they're expecting around average runoff, pending a larger event. They do feel confident in the amount of flood storage space that they have. Fremont County is down in southwest Iowa, so you're below the Platte. You are susceptible there to a or larger, some kind of large convective event where you could lead to some minor flooding, but we don't, we don't foresee any major problems at this point.
Dennis, I'm going to bring up a couple more pictures of things. Here is the May, June, July outlook that didn't get into your presentation. Do you want to describe these? Can you see it? First of all, can you see what we're looking at here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, May, June, July swaps. We swap from May to what we look like much more in the June, July, August, where temperatures are more likely above average throughout the region. The only place that is EC, or equal chances, is part of that area that is projected to be wetter than average, which kind of goes along in the spring and summer. When you are wetter than average in the plains, you tend to be cooler than average. So that limits the warmth capability there. The May, June, July precipitation, again, very similar to what we saw in the June, July, August, where wetter than average is more likely in the mountains up to Montana, and then the drier than average area kind of splits the difference between what we saw in May and then the June, July, August. Again, most times they don't have a great amount of confidence in precipitation outlooks in the warm season because precipitation is so difficult to project. But this is what the best guidance is at this point.
And then we also had a question early on about ice coverage, and really I think we showed that there was a 2% ice coverage in the Great Lakes right now. 2/10 of 1%?
0.2%, yes.
Oh, 0.2, okay. Normally this time of year, I looked up the average for this time of year. It's about 5%. So
Okay.
really, the ice melt, the average is pretty low by this time in any case. Here's the long-term sort of average of the Great Lakes annual maximum ice coverage, just in case anybody's interested. Obviously, this will be updated in 2017 as well. There is a tendency to have to be less than that, certainly since the late 90s. There are relatively few years with above normal ice coverage. And let's see, is there anything else I was going to show? I think that's about it. Oh, you know what, Dennis? The one thing, it take me a minute to find this, but we can just talk through it, I think. We did get from the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center a bit of an outlook in terms of their flood outlook. Again, this is very much concerned just with the Missouri Basin, but they were highlighting the Wind River Basin because of the massive snowpack out there. Some places up to 200% of normal snow. It's going to depend on how warm it gets and how quickly. If it warms up slowly, that's a good thing. That sends that water down a little more slowly. The other thing is the other area of concern, which is always of concern, I would argue, is pretty much much of the lower basin. I'd say eastern Kansas and much of Missouri. As convective storms and such. This is the wet time of year, May and June, and that can cause flooding, not necessarily on the Missouri River, but on the tributaries to it. So,
and I think there was also a comment on the Platte too, that because there will be a pretty decent flow into the Platte, that if you were to have a big event on the Platte, you could get some minor flooding there too. So.
We were asked the question: is this series in danger of being eliminated? Eliminated. I'll just leave it at that. And not to our knowledge, we're going to continue with this. I imagine that there will be, this is sort of, if you will, real-time climate information and drought information, so we're hoping it won't be. And thanks for that question. Certainly, if you feel strongly about that, you can let others know.
Doug, should we tell them? Doug, should we tell them what's happened if the dollars that support this are eliminated? Given that there's no dollars that officially support this, so.
There are no dollars to support. Well, no, let's not get into that. I think we said enough. The amount of ice in the Arctic is extremely low. Will that have any impacts on the spring and summer weather patterns? It's a great question. I wish we had an answer for you. The one thing I'll say about that, and I think Barb might have something else to say about that. But what I'll say simply is spring and summer weather patterns are not nearly as connected to shifts in the Arctic as perhaps the wintertime is. There is great debate and great discussion amongst climate scientists on what, if any, impact there is between Arctic sea ice and, we'll say, the weather around the globe. So, Paul, I don't have a good answer for you at this time. Check back and if and when the science gets sorted out. Sorry
there was an article and a blog post just put out within the last week or so about some research being done on this. But Doug was right. There is a great deal of discussion about what it really means and what the impacts are. Okay. Great questions, everybody. Are there any other comments or questions? If you have any, always feel free to email Dennis or myself or anybody else on that list that Dennis had on there earlier. That's what we do for a living, is answer a lot of questions and communicate this type of science. So thank you let's see. Let's make sure I got everybody. Yep, I think I got everybody covered here. Anybody else have any other questions? I don't see any. But I do thank you all very much for coming. Pat Gannon, the state climatologist from Missouri, will be the representative's presenter next month, and I think it's May 18th. So do I got that date right? Yeah, May 18th. So we'll see you then. Thank you very much again.